Great, thank you. During the last session, there were a number of questions we weren't able to get to, so hopefully you were able to connect with Latrice and Jamie during the break. If not, please see them at lunch and we can ensure that we get those questions answered. So during that session, I heard a number of things related to stakeholders and preparing or participating in initiatives out there. So Chris Raper is in the back. Chris, if you'll raise your hand. Thank you. We are, as Melanie stated, our vision is really the voice of reliability and security in the Western interconnection. And so while this is the reliability and security workshop, our stakeholder body is a little broader than that. So if you're interested in knowing how you can get involved or what other initiatives are out there, please contact engage@wec.org and we can help facilitate getting you connected to the right initiatives that you're interested in. But I also heard Jamie mention a call to action. So to the extent that you are not involved in the standards drafting process and want to be, again, have those conversations with Latrice and Jamie at the break or at lunch. So our next session is on Project 2021-07, Extreme Cold Weather, Grid Operations, Preparedness, and Coordination. And during this session, you will hear from NERC staff. We've got Allison Oswald, Manager of Standards Development, and Kyle Lyons, Senior Manager of Compliance Assurance, here to share information about cold weather and also information about how you can participate in an upcoming small group advisory session related to cold weather. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them both to the stage. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Oswald. I'm the person that stands between you and lunch, so I'll try to make this as interesting and painless as possible. Okay, let's see. All right, today I'm here to talk about Project 2021-07. I'm going to cover the background of that project, including a brief overview of the February 2021 freeze event. Additionally, I'll cover the development timeframe and the key recommendations and directives that the drafting team was tasked with meeting. We're going to review the 3 standards that were created and revised during this project, and this should help you all gain a deeper understanding of the revisions made to TOP2, EOP11, and EOP12 to assist with future audit preparation. So this project was initiated from the Joint Inquiry Report into the February 2021 freeze event. I'm sure most of you know a lot about that report, so we won't go into too much detail. Briefly, the event was a multi-day event. It impacted Texas and the South Central US. It was the 4th event in the past 10 years to jeopardize the bulk power system due to unplanned generation outages. This report had 28 key recommendations, and recommendation 1 was directed towards modifications to the reliability standards and had 10 subparts. So this project was developed in 3 different phases. The team started working on the standard modifications in February 2022 after some SAR revisions. The project was split into the 2 phases originally with NERC board and FERC directive deadlines. They each had a September and a NERC board deadline of September and a FERC deadline of November for 2022 and 2023, respectively. Phase 1 addressed the 4 key recommendations listed on this slide, and it resulted in the team making modifications to EOP11 and proposing a new standard EOP12. Phase 2 was targeting 6 key recommendations from the report, and the team modified EOP11 again and modified TOP25. While the team was working on these 2 phases, FERC issued an order in February of 2023, and that addressed the filing from the previous November of EOP11-4 and EOP12-1. So in this order, FERC directed more changes to EOP12-1, and this initiated a 3rd phase of the project to make all necessary modifications of EOP 12-1 by February of 2024. So just recently filed that. So since this project was over the course of 2.5 years, and we made multiple modifications to 2 standards, I'm just going to cover the end result of what will be applicable to entities going forward. So starting off with EOP 11-4, here's a quick mapping slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me change it up there. A quick mapping slide that shows the key recommendations to the parts of the standard where you will see the changes. So recommendation 1J was that transmission owners, operators, and distribution providers should have separation of circuits used for manual load shed. 1H is that balancing authorities plans should prohibit the use of demand response of critical natural gas infrastructure loads. Should try to say that a few times. The drafting team really got hung up on that one. 1I has additional details in the sub-bullets, but the main theme of the recommendation was to protect critical natural gas infrastructure loads from manual and automatic load shedding. So one additional thing I want to touch on before we jump into some of the details is that the applicability of EOP 11-4 was expanded from the previously approved versions. Transmission operators are usually dependent on distribution providers, UFLS only distribution providers, and transmission owners to implement portions of requirement R1.2.5 that we'll cover next. So the drafting team determined that it was necessary to expand the applicability of EOP 11 to include those functions. All right, on the screen you see the text of 1.2.5 of EOP 11. This was to address recommendation 1J, and it's language in the standard for provisions that the TOP must include in their operating plan to identify and prioritize critical natural gas infrastructure loads. Requirement 1.2.5 was modified to include under voltage load shed and under frequency load shed as well. The addition of UVLS and UFLS throughout requirement 1.2.5 requires these load shed processes to account for the minimization of overlap. So as an additional result of this modification, in part 1.2.5.5 at the bottom of the slide, which requires the identification and prioritization of critical natural gas infrastructure loads, it's also applicable to load shedding, be it manual, UVLS, or UFLS. So please note also that the drafting team did not make a definition of critical natural gas infrastructure loads. This was to provide flexibility for individual entities to apply this term in the manner that's appropriate to their situation. All right, next, requirement R2.2.8 was added to address key recommendation 1H by prohibiting the use of critical natural gas infrastructure loads for demand response. This does not apply to all natural gas infrastructure loads. Instead, the balancing authority is only required to exclude those critical natural gas infrastructure loads which are essential to the reliability of the BES. Recommendation 1I requires that the balancing authority include in their operating plan provisions for operator-controlled manual load shedding that identifies and protects critical natural gas infrastructure loads in their respective areas. Further, the recommendation also includes provisions within the operating plan to require manual, UVLS, and UFLS load shed entities within their respective footprints to protect identified critical natural gas infrastructure loads. The current provision that's in 2.2.9 on the screen, which references transmission operator responsibilities under 1.2.5, which was shown previously, satisfies the requirements of that key recommendation. Requirement R7 and R8 are both new to EOP 11-4, and they help to support the modifications that were made in Requirement 1 and Requirement 2. Since the transmission operator plan for the larger transmission area will be executed by the actions of the transmission owner, distribution provider, and UFLS only DP. So Requirement 7 was added so that transmission operators will annually identify and notify any DPs, UFL only DPs, and transmission owners that are required to assist in the mitigation of operating emergencies. Requirement 8 is a new requirement specific to those entities identified in R7. It includes the relevant portions of R1.2.5 that address operator-controlled manual load shedding, UFLS or UVLS, because many times they are the entities that perform this function and have the capability of ensuring that these requirements are appropriately implemented. All right, next we'll go on to TOP 2-5. This was written or modified, I guess, to address key recommendation 1G from the report. 1G asks for greater specificity about the roles of the GO, the GOP, and the BA in determining generating capacity that can be relied upon during cold weather. The report contains more details than what's shown on the screen, such as asking the GO and the GOP to provide total percentage of generating units capacity that the BA can rely upon. So the drafting team had multiple discussions about the use of this requirements language in terms of calculating percentages. And what you're going to see on the slides when we review TOP2 is not that exact language, but the drafting team felt that they met the spirit of the recommendation, which was to provide the BAs with the necessary information for them to proactively look at the grid during cold weather and manage that risk. So to do this, the drafting team wrote a new R8 into TOP 2-5. So this is a requirement for the BA to have an operating process that is unique from the operating plan that is in requirement 4 of this standard. The team saw the operating plan as a year-round plan and the process as something that only came into play under certain conditions, so we wanted to make sure that those were not linked in the standard. This process is for the BAs to utilize the information received from the generator owner and information from previous cold weather events to determine the appropriate reserve margins needed during extreme cold weather events. So the operating process includes 3 different methodologies that are listed here on the screen. First, there's a methodology to define for the unique balancing authority area what is extreme cold weather. This could be different across balancing authorities based on geographical locations, so the drafting team did not define this in the standard. Second, to determine based on previous cold weather events what is an appropriate reserve margin. And finally, to have a 5-day hourly forecast during these cold weather conditions to anticipate times when reserves will be short with the intent of getting generation put online earlier. Additionally, the team discussed how the current TOP3 data specification already provides the mechanism for BAs to get any information that they want. The team did not make any changes there because they believe that BAs will ask for the information that they need, and they did not want to be overly prescriptive. So here you can see the text of the standard. And you can see where part 8.2 aligns with the data specification information that the BA is receiving in TOP3. Okay, next we're going to jump into the meat of the project, which was really EOP 12. Standard EOP 12 went through creation and 1 revision during the course of this project. EOP 12 and some new defined terms were created to address 6 of the 10 key recommendations from the cold weather report. The next slides are going to cover the recommendations, and then we'll get into the directives from the FERC February 2023 order. Okay. 1A and 1B, they work together for the generator owner to identify cold weather critical components and to implement freeze protection measures on those critical components. 1C is for the generator owner to account for the effects of precipitation and wind that would limit their generating unit's performance in providing temperature data that's included in the cold weather preparedness plan. All right, continuing on, 1D states that the generator owner that experiences outages, failures to start, or derates should develop and implement a corrective action plan and to evaluate similar equipment across the fleet that could be impacted. 1E was the most straightforward of all the recommendations and asked for the previous training requirement that was included in EOP 11-2R8 to be provided annually. And 1F asked for units to operate to a specific ambient temperature. So in addition to those 6 key recommendations, EOP 12 also had to address the FERC 2023 order directives. And we're going to cover those on the next slide, of which there were 5. So first was that the applicability section be revised to include all BES generation and not just those that operate during cold weather. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Second, more clarity on the constraints that were included in the first draft of the standard that was filed with FERC were directed. Third was a modification around the continuous operation language that was included in the first draft. This was to ensure that some technology types didn't get excluded from the standard. Fourth, cap deadlines were to be included in this modified standard that was not originally included in the first draft. And finally, FERC asked for a shorter implementation period, given that the 2021 freeze event was the 4th event in the last 10 years. So as stated previously, the drafting team created new definitions to satisfy the report recommendations. There was 5 of those in total. So we'll review those next before we jump into the details about EOP 12. The first one is extreme cold weather temperature. So this is a calculated temperature equal to the lowest 0.2 percentile of the hourly temperatures measured in December, January, and February from January 1st of 2000 through the date the temperature is calculated. This definition was developed by the drafting team to provide clarity to the generator owner on determining what temperature triggers the requirement obligations. The date of January 1, 2000 was chosen because that was the completion of a modernization effort by the National Weather Service, and that should make it fairly accessible for companies to gather data and perform the required analysis. December through February timeframe was selected to correspond to meteorological winter as defined by NOAA. So the drafting team also provided a technical paper showing how to download the data and do this calculation. It's on the drafting team's project page and should be included in the one-stop shop as well. All right, the next 2 definitions are generator cold weather critical component and fixed fuel supply component. So for generator cold weather critical component, the drafting team felt that the best method to address where freeze protection measures should be implemented was to define a term with a specific subset of components that could be susceptible to freezing and are critical to the operation of the unit. Generator owners should consider previous freeze-related issues experienced by the unit, as well as actions taken to mitigate those issues when establishing their list of generator cold weather critical components. Now, fixed fuel supply is a term within the generator cold weather critical component that the team also defined. The intent of this was to clarify that mobile equipment is not part of the term, but permanent fixed equipment that impacts fuel delivery is to be included. The next definition is generator cold weather reliability event. The key recommendation about developing and implementing CAPs was the basis for the team to make this definition. The report identified that most of the outages and derates that were experienced in the 2021 event were due to freezing of instrumentation, transmitters, sensing lines, or wind turbine blades. So the drafting team developed parameters around these events to clarify a reasonable baseline of what level of derate qualifies an event and provided additional language to identify what constitutes a startup failure. So I want to also point out that the generator cold weather reliability event only occurs at the extreme cold weather temperature. We'll call that ECWT going forward. So this creates a situation where a unit is required to operate at a certain temperature, that's the calculated ECWT, and anytime they experience one of the 3 criteria in the cold weather reliability event at or above that temperature, then a cap will be triggered to resolve this issue. All right, finally, the last definition the drafting team created was for generator cold weather constraint. In the first draft of EOP 12, the constraint language was included in the standard and not in a definition. FERC directed NERC to clarify this language, and the team ultimately determined that a definition was the correct path forward. The definition you see on the screen is the one the drafting team ultimately landed on after multiple iterations, and it relies upon the industry's long practice of using good utility practice as a basis for implementing new practices, methods, or technologies. Based on this language, the drafting team believes that declaring a constraint is going to be something that's used very sparingly. The team also believes that this definition, in combination with the language in the standard, supports the adoption of new freeze protection practices, methods, or technologies, but does not require the immediate use of those should a leading utility pilot a novel approach. Okay, next we're going to walk through the standard from start to finish since it is a brand new standard. We'll start with the applicability section. The FERC directive wanted to ensure that no generating resources were excluded from this standard. So the team made sure to include inclusion I2 through I4 from the BES definition as the facilities that are applicable. So there's no longer exceptions that are prescribed in the applicability section of the standard. Any exceptions that a utility would not have to comply with are required through the specific language and requirements 2 and 3. R1 is applicable to all generator owners and their generating units, not just those that operate in cold weather. It requires that once every 5 years, the ECWT is calculated and certain cold weather data is identified. For the ECWT, this calculation is a rolling calculation. So you'll start at the year 2000, and every 5 years, you're going to be adding in data to that calculation. And the lowest calculated ECWT should always be used. If a lower calculated ECWT is found during this 5-year cycle, then the GO shall update their plan and any corrective actions needed for the protection of the critical components. And they have to do that within 6 months. The generating unit cold weather data and minimums are mostly carried over from the previous EOP 11-2, which was done by the 2019-06 cold weather team. And the same data is required to be requested by balancing authorities through TOP 3. So here you can see a side-by-side of EOP 12-2 and TOP 3 that shows that that data is the same. The only difference would be that the GO is going to be including wind speed and precipitation when they have that information available in the unit minimums that are required in part 1.2.2. And this is to meet the key recommendation 1C from the report. All right, requirement R2 and R3 are essentially the same requirement for generator owners to provide capability to operate at the calculated ECWT by implementing freeze protection measures on their generator cold weather critical components. And if they cannot do that, they should develop a cap to add new or modify existing freeze protection measures on those components. There are two differences between R2 and R3. So first, R2 applies to units with the commercial operation date on or after October 1 of 2027. These units will be required to operate for 12 continuous hours at their ECWT and take into account a concurrent 20-mile-per-hour wind speed. Those not yet in the design phase must design to this from the start, but the team believed that there needed to be allowances made for units that are in the development process and for which the design phase has already been completed. Therefore, if units enter commercial operation on or after October 1, 2027, and they cannot operate to that 12 continuous hours with the 20-mile-per-hour wind speed included, they will have to develop a cap. And the cap implementation and deadlines are discussed later in the standard. R3 applies to existing generation units and requires them to operate at the ECWT, but it does not have a specific time component related to it like R2 does. If a generating unit cannot adhere to the requirements of R3, it is also required to develop a cap that requires either new freeze protection measures or modification of existing freeze protection measures to be able to provide that capacity at the ECWT. So R4 is for generator owners to develop and maintain a cold weather preparedness plan. This is an expansion of the plan that was previously required under R7 of EOP 11-2. This plan now also has to include the lowest calculated ECWT from R1, as well as the cold weather data that's identified in R1. The plan includes the unit's generator cold weather critical components, and it should document any freeze protection measures on those components. Finally, the plan includes a requirement for the annual inspection and maintenance of all freeze protection measures, which is also carried over from EOP 11-2. EOP 11-2 requirement R8 was moved over to EOP 12-2 R5. So this language remains exactly the same except for the single red line that you see on the page here, showing that the training now has to be provided annually. The intent of this training is to be provided to operational personnel who are responsible for inspection, maintenance, or ensuring the operability of freeze protection measures. The drafting team anticipates that the training for personnel may include instructions on actions taken to prepare the unit for cold weather operations prior to the cold weather season, as well as actions taken when cold weather events are forecasted and occurring in real time. All right, EOP 12-2 requirement 6. This was written to address key recommendation 1D. As stated previously, the report identified that most of the outages were due to freezing of instrumentation, transmitters, sensing lines, or wind turbine blades. Because of this, the drafting team followed the report recommendation to require a cap when the apparent cause of an event is due to freezing. To do this, the drafting team created the term generator cold weather reliability event, which we reviewed a few slides previous. When a generator experiences a cold weather reliability event, the cap has to be completed, or has to be developed, within 150 days or by July 1st at the latest. And the drafting team chose this timeline to allow a generator owner to review multiple events holistically and to come up with one cap for any equipment that had common causes of failure. Okay, requirement 7 is the implementation of the caps. And a cap could come out of requirement 1, 2, 3, or 6. So as a summary, requirement 1 was any new freeze protection measures that are needed and associated with the 5-year review of the ECWT. Requirement 2 is new generation cold weather capability. Requirement 3 is existing generation cold weather capability. And requirement 6 is the correction of any generation following a cold weather reliability event. So the FERC directive came out and wanted the team to establish requirements for the duration of cap timelines. Previously, that had not been written into the first draft of EOP 12. So the drafting team modeled these timelines after TPL 7, and they're divided into 2 different categories. First are those which address existing freeze protection measures, and those have 24 months from development of the cap to be completed. And second is those which require new equipment or new freeze protection measures, and they have 48 months to be completed. These are maximum durations, and it is expected that entities will work diligently to correct issues and take prompt actions to mitigate future issues as soon as practical. If the GO is unable to complete a cap within the timeframes listed, or the corrective actions change, then the GO is required to update the cap with justification. The last part of R7 goes into the declaration process, and it states that a GO should document in a declaration with justification any generator cold weather constraint that precludes the generator owner from implementing selected actions contained within the cap. So this constraint process is further covered in R8, which we'll get to. However, I just wanted to state that the team intended if one or more actions within a cap fall under a constraint declaration, it was the intent that only those affected actions would not be implemented and the rest of the cap would be implemented. So here you can see a diagram of the cap and declaration process and how it all works together. If a constraint is declared under R7, then the declaration has to be reviewed every 5 years or when a change of status to the constraint occurs. It's the drafting team's intent that the generator owner will be cognizant of their constraints and will proactively remove them when it's applicable. If during the review, limitations or the timeline of implementation changes, then R2 requires updating the items that were listed back in R1.2. Updated constraint declarations would also require an update to the operating limitations provided via the data specification. So in this manner, information relevant to taking a constraint declaration will be made available to the planning and operational entities pursuant to its data collection authority in TOP3 and IRO 10. So what's the status of the standards now? Because this project has been going on for 2.5 years. FERC approved EOP 11.4 in February, but it indicated that they would defer approving the implementation plan until they had a chance to look at what was filed for EOP 12-2. NERC filed EOP 12-2 on February 16, 2024, and asked for an expedited action. So much is still uncertain and will depend on what FERC orders and when that order comes out. So it's our hope that a successor EOP 11 standard, whether that be -3 or -4, will become effective on 10/1 of 2024. But we expect that FERC's order on EOP 12-2 will contain more information regarding that. As for TOP2, it will become effective on October 1, 2025. FERC also directed NERC to revise the EOP 12-2 implementation plan to require shorter implementation and suggested that a staggered implementation for units in a generator owner's fleet would be appropriate. The drafting team discussed this, and they chose to propose an equally effective solution, which was to not stagger the implementation, but instead shorten the whole implementation plan to get measures in faster. So what you see on the screen here is what the implementation would be if EOP 12-2 was approved. All the requirements except for R3 would go into effect on 10/1/2024, and R3 would go into effect a year later on 10/1/2025. Here's just a visual to show the implementation plan. And I believe next Kyle has some information on small group advisory sessions.
Yeah, thanks, Allison, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you this morning. Thank you to WEC for the invite to come talk with you all. As Allison said, my name is Kyle Lyons. I'm the Senior Manager in Compliance Assurance. And our Compliance Assurance group at NERC works very closely with our risk and compliance monitoring groups at all of the regional entities, primarily focused on how we continue to mature our compliance monitoring and risk processes to be more holistically encompassing of risk and controls and compliance altogether as one uniform process, right? And Allison here, who was very humble in her introduction, is not only the person who stands between you and lunch, but is also the one who has been working pretty much daily with the cold weather drafting teams for 2.5 years now to get these standards in place. And she did a fantastic job covering all the changes that are coming. I have been also involved in the cold weather work from a different perspective. I've been the NERC co-lead on the 2018 Elliott and Uri inquiries, as well as the NERC co-lead on the operational performance review for Jerry and Heather that Melanie mentioned in her opening comments. So I've got the opportunity to work with industry on just about every inquiry that we've undertaken and be heavily involved in the development of the recommendations and watching the drafting work unfold. And so I've got the privilege of being able to see this from multiple perspectives. And today I've been given the just small task of helping to make sure that you you all are ready to address these risks and comply with EOP 12, which I'm sure there are no questions after Allison's presentation. But just in case, buckle up, and I think I can get us out of here before dinner, and we can cover everything. No, I'm just kidding. We actually have a much better tool than me rambling on to get you guys ready for complying with the cold weather standards, and those are the small group advisory sessions. This is a tool that is becoming more and more adopted by NERC in the regions. We think it adds a lot of value, and hopefully you all see the value in participating in these. If you are staring at me blankly and have no idea what a small group advisory session is, I'll give you just a little bit of information. Small group advisory session, or SGAS, as you may have heard them called, and for those playing acronym bingo at your seat, there's another one for you. But these are activities we do ahead of the enforceable dates of the standard, and they really have two parts. One is a general session webinar, and this is open to anybody, regardless of whether you want to participate in the one-on-one sessions that I'll talk about in a minute. But I strongly encourage that even if you have no desire to participate in the one-on-ones, I would strongly encourage you to sign up for the general session webinar. The small group advisory sessions are run by a team of NERC and participants from all of the regional entities. The general session webinar will cover all the common questions we get from entities ahead of the small group advisory session. So there is a lot of good information that will come out of that. Registration for that will come out separately. So stay tuned. That'll be coming out in the next couple weeks. The small group advisory sessions will be held the week of May 6th. The general session will kick it off, and then really the main component of the small group advisory sessions, as the name suggests, is the opportunity for any interested entities to meet one-on-one with a team of NERC and regional entity staff, be able to go through what you are planning to do to comply with EOP 12 and mitigate those risks, and get some real-time feedback from NERC and the regional entity staff on basically your readiness to do that. You know, does it look like the risk is mitigated? Are we seeing the right controls be put in place? Does it look like you have a sustainable plan to meet compliance with these requirements? So we think there's a lot of benefit both ways for that. We are going to be doing this virtually. We know a lot of entities, especially some of the smaller generator owners and operators, do not have a large travel budget. So we are trying to find ways to encourage them and make sure they're able to participate in this as well. So we are doing this all virtually. And then hopefully, you know, even for those that may have a bigger travel budget, it's always nice to have more of your SMEs be able to participate than you may otherwise, you know, bring if we did it in Atlanta or some other location. So we do think that provides some good opportunities there. We will also be updating, we have a cold weather FAQ document that currently resides on NERC.com. We will be updating that for the upcoming standards and also based on the questions we get from these small group advisory sessions. So be watching for that as well. And again, when you get registered for the webinar and stuff like that, that helps us track and make sure that folks do get that information as it comes out. The announcement and registrations for the small group advisory sessions were sent to the primary compliance contacts in CORS and Align, as well as sent out to the NERC general rosters. But if you did not, and registration technically closed Friday for the one-on-ones, but if you did not see that announcement or you missed the date and you really do want to participate, come find me on a break and I'll get you plugged in with our team and try to get you worked into that still. I think they said we had about 50 entities interested in the one-on-ones, so it's quite a busy week for us. So we'll try to get as many folks plugged into that as we can. Yeah, and if you have any other burning compliance questions for me on cold weather or any other SIP or OMP topic, come find me on a break. Happy to meet you and and see if we can get you some answers to questions. But other than that, thanks. I think we're ready to take some questions.
Okay, just one. Go for it.
All right. First of all, I just want to say thank you to both of you for presenting and coming out here to the WEC workshop. I think Melanie, you highlighted that cold weather is a big topic out here. Certainly, we had our own little cold weather event in the Pacific Northwest, so I think it is top of mind for all of us. Introduction-wise, my name is Jenny White. I work for Tacoma Power. I'm their compliance lead, but most importantly, I am the focus group chair with WICIF. For new standards implementation. And so I get a lot of questions on EOP 12-2. So I'm hoping to ask some of those, and maybe they'll help them also with your FAQ if you can't answer them today. One question that's come up with some of the WICIF membership is with R 1.1 and 1.2.2. So 1.1 is ECWT. And then 1.2.2 is calculating your design operating temperature or your historical operating temperatures. We were wondering, can you use your ECWT to meet 1.2.2?
The generating unit minimums and 1.2.2.
Right. Could you credit your ECWT as your engineering analysis or like your historical operating temperature?
Sure.
I think I may have shut it off. There we go. Yeah, so I would say definitely submit that one. I don't want to answer off the cuff on that one. I would definitely want to take that back and look at it to make sure we give clarity there. But yeah, I would definitely want to take that one back and make sure we run that through our team.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question that also comes up is audit materials if you are a null entity. So if you, whether through the ECWT, conclude that you're not an applicable generation, or if you have all of your critical components in heated buildings, right? So you meet that exclusion criteria. How do you document that, right? What's the audit documentation that you're looking for?
Sure, I can start with that one. So I mean that's going to vary, right? I mean there's no necessarily right or wrong answer, right? I mean what we're looking for is how did you come to that conclusion? Can you step us through the thought process, right? And then how are you kind of monitoring that for changes to the ECWT and whatnot as required by the requirements? So there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do that. Again, what we'd be interested is the thought process that you went through to arrive at that conclusion, right? How you validated that. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then another question that comes up regarding this null list. So there's a requirement to perform the annual training. What if you aren't an applicable entity or all of your critical components are in a heated building, so you really don't have any cold weather actions to take? Do you still need to perform that annual training?
I would not. I would have to again read it, but I wouldn't think so because I think it's going to be training on the actions identified in your plan. If I remember the language off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's training on implementing the cold weather preparedness plan. So
Right. So you wouldn't have any steps in the plan to train on then, right?
Okay.
So again, just laying out that train of logic, right? Because it may not be that clean cut, every time, right?
Yeah, agreed. Okay, thank you. I will step off then. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenny. I've sat in many of your sessions so far, so thank you for that info. I'm Kristen Abel from Pacificor, and I have a couple of questions from our SME on this topic. He's also wondering about 1.2.2 and regarding the historical operating temperature. For assessment of that, he's wondering if there's any guidance or requirement on the specific look back period. How far back do we need to look?
the drafting team didn't write any guidance around that specifically on like how many years back to look to find it.
Okay. And then regarding the identification of the critical cold weather components, If they are identified in our preventative maintenance plans, do they need to be called out in a separate section of our cold weather plan, or what is sufficient for identifying those?
As in how it's documented,
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
as in how you document it. And
Yes, yeah, what's the
Yes.
expectation there?
How would you want to see that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. This is, these are, but I'm glad you asked, because this highlights the exact type of conversations that really do benefit from the one-on-one, because then you can show us, right? You can show us, here's what we're thinking. What does this make sense? What else would you want to see, right? It's hard a little bit to guess as to what that would look like, right? And that's why, instead of me trying to ramble for an hour on what good compliance would look like, and still not answer 90% of the questions. That's why we do rely a lot on these small group advisory sessions to be able to see what you're actually thinking. What does it actually look like for you? Does it make sense? Right. And what feedback would we have on that? So I will just use that as a plug. That's a great example. If you've got a question like that, come on and to the small group advisory sessions, and we'd be happy to step through exactly what that looks like for you and be able to provide some feedback if we have any on that.
Okay, thank you.
We have received some online questions. The first one, is NERC taking into consideration the protest filed with FERC on March 22nd, 2024 by the ISO RTO Council urging FERC to direct NERC to revise EOP 12-2 because it is too vague?
We are aware of the comments that are filed. NERC will be filing a response, and any other questions outside of that, I'll defer to Latrice or the communications staff at NERC.
Yeah, and just let me add on as well. We will be filing comments to that regard, and also we can't discuss it or answer any questions right now, but those comments will be made in the filing from NERC.
Thank you. Thanks for jumping in, Latrice. If a GOP with design documentation stating that the minimum operating temperature is below the ECWT and not having any identified cold weather preparedness requirements, is there still an expectation of annual training per R5?
A very loaded question. Yeah, that's another one that's going to be hard to answer off the cuff. And again, I would want to see what that actually looks like for that particular entity before giving any opinions on a question like that.
Okay, one more. For EOP 12R2, self-commit is not capitalized. There isn't a place that defines what this means unless you go into power markets. How does WEC or NERC define self-commit, and what can we look to for that definition?
Yeah, I mean, generally, right, what we're looking for there is you plan on running it in the winter, right? If you are bidding into the market that you are available to run during the winter, then that's generally what we're looking for there, right? Again, what that means for you, we would be interested. But the idea there is, right, is if you are planning on running during the winter, then the standard is applicable to you, right? If you're going to mothball that unit for the winter, then generally it doesn't apply to you, right? Wouldn't make any sense to winterize that. So, I mean, from a far left, far right, perspective, that's about as far as I can go on that one right now.
Great. Just didn't want to take up all the airtime since no one else is asking the questions. Some other questions that have come up in WCIF discussions is, in the generator cold weather critical components, there's this exclusion for, as I mentioned, inside heated buildings. But what about HVAC? So if you are saying that you don't have any critical components because you're in heated buildings, does that then make your heating system for that building a critical component?
I would have to go back through. I don't believe it would, because I believe that the critical components are specific to the freeze protection measures installed on the generating unit. But I would have to look.
Okay, great.
My recollection when the drafting team discussed that, they did not then say that the HVAC was a critical component, because you start getting to like a circular, then what keeps the HVAC running now? That's a critical component.
Right.
So From my
Yeah.
understanding, I would agree with Kyle that it would not be.
Agreed, and that was my understanding as well, but it certainly is a question that comes up frequently. Just making sure and one other question that we had, and maybe Latrice and Jamie can help with this one. So there is that BES exclusionary language in the applicability, right? That it only applies to BES generators. Is that planning on changing to incorporate the non-BES IBRs? Is that on the slate for EOP 12-2 to get that added? Do we know?
I would say, I mean, it's not in 12-2, right? So any
No.
modification to that would require modification to the standard to change that, right?
Right. Do we know if that's in the plans? Like, will these non-BES IBRs that'll be registered as category 2, will they be applicable to EOP 12 in the future?
Can we get back to you on that one?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Hey, Alice with PCS. I just wanted to add on to a topic Jenny just brought up. I know that it's not exactly the same definition of a cold weather critical component between the Texas PUC and NERC. But as we know, there are inspections happening by ERCOT staff, and they are telling generators that HVAC should be on their list of cold weather critical components. So I just wanted to give you that feedback, right? Because there's a lot of generators that have to comply with both. And, you know, I think this is where we have an opportunity to provide more clarity.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate that feedback. We'll take that back and I'll pass that along to the small group advisory session team.
We had a clarifying question. Are the small group advisories still available virtually?
So yeah, what I would say is registration closed on Friday. So if you are interested, definitely reach out to either the name in the announcement, which would have been Derek Casimir at NERC, or get in contact with myself, and I'll make sure that team is aware, and we'll try to work that into the best that we can.
So Maylee, did we have any other questions come in? Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Kyle and Allison for a great presentation today. Sounds like we need to have some follow-up on some of these questions, but thank you. So it sounds like we can go to lunch early. I think it's ready. Is that right, Maylee? Lunch is ready. Okay. So please plan on being back at 1 p.m. Thank you.